Trainmaster is a supervisor, and he's pretty much responsible for the operations of the railroad.
I would go down there with my bicycle and a couple burlap sacks because there was always grain left over in those boxcars.
Everybody knew everybody else's lives.
We'd skate or ride our bicycles around the train station there and wait for the trains to come in.
There used to be horses up here. They had slaughterhouses.
The first railroad to service our area was named the Petaluma and Haystack Railroad. But it didn't even come to Petaluma. It fell 2 miles short of our city. You'll hear more about that in this episode of Petaluma Memories.
Oh, the railroad. I used to ride the railroad all the time to go up to my grandparents in Healdsburg. And my mother would take me down here and put me on the train. And we knew the conductor. He was a family friend from up in Healdsburg. He was a good friend with my aunt up there. And he would watch out for me, and I'd go up there, and then my grandfather would pick me up, and take me up to the house at the depot, and then when I come home, they'd take me there, and in fact, the conductor's name, I still remember it. His last name was Black, and he watch out for me until I got home, and then as I got older, I still went up there until I was lucky enough to buy a vehicle of my own when I was in senior in high school, so bought a little old Model 8, and then I didn't use the train anymore. But up until then, that's how I used to go up to my grandparents' house, spend the summer.
A little bit of your Petaluma Railroad history still exists. Example is motor number 8, found in a field falling apart in the Pengrove, Petaluma area. Another example you might be able to see is at the Western Railway Museum at Rio Vista, and you can actually take a ride on a PNSR car number 63 that ran out of Petaluma. I'd like to show you an example of motor number 8 in its original configuration. This photograph was probably taken about 1904 in Petaluma. I'd like to show you now the doors, which are new, been reproduced off the originals, which were too deteriorated. This hardware here, we had half of the hardware. We had the hardware for one side, the door rollers for one side. And a good friend of ours, Lloyd Butler, reproduced the casting patterns so we could have the other side created. So half of these are original and half of these are new. The ribs for the roof and the side roofs are basically all new. The trim inside is the original trim. The original was able to be reused. The window frames are in oak, and that's what they were made out of originally. The rest is all fir and some redwood. The car was built by the Holman Car Company in San Francisco, and they used all local woods, redwood and fir for construction of their cars. If you had an East Coast car, it would be hardwoods probably.
I lived a block away from the railroad station. We were around the railroad trains all the time. In fact, my brother and I, when we were real young, would go over to the ice house, which is where, let's see what's there now. The CVS and the drugstore and the auto parts. There was a ice house there when we were kids. That was all a big ice house with railroad tracks that they were icing the railroad cars. And every so often the trains would come in and the guys would go through them. They were shipping it back east, and they would throw off all the fruit and vegetables that was wasn't going to make it. All the watermelons that were cracked got thrown out by the tracks. We'd go with the wagon and pick up the best watermelon you could get. They were all cracked. They're cracked because they're ripe. And so we got the best of everything. There's cantaloupe, watermelons, and vegetables of all kinds that they just threw out on the side of the track, and we go help ourselves. And all of us kids that knew about it would go with wagons. It looked like a circus at times that we were all in there picking up the stuff. But it was all good stuff. It wasn't because it was rotten or anything. It was because it was ripe and it wouldn't keep.
My father was, as a train master, is in charge of the shipping side of things, and he dealt with all the shippers that used the rails. So he organized all the cars that had to be set out for them. He picked up their cars and he organized the trains going where their merchant, where the trains had to come. So he brought in incoming and he brought out outgoing.
Jerry Faustine, he was a train master. He was a supervisor position. And he was my father's supervisor, then he was my supervisor as well. And he lived here in Santa Rosa, and he would come down to Santa Rosa Depot and also Petaluma, because Petaluma was a busy place. Even though Santa Rosa was a bigger town, Petaluma was a busier train station. The train master is a supervisor, and he's pretty much responsible for the operations of the railroad. They had the authority to change the way things would be done for a particular reason. In other words, I couldn't just take it on myself to make a change. Even though I may know what to do, I have to have authority to do so, and that would come from a train master.
He was considered part of management, and that is why he was a salaried employee, and he had responsibility 24/7 for the crews on, where his trains were, what they were being made up, if there was a disaster.
The history of railroading in Sonoma County is a complicated one, but famed industrialists at Petaluma knows John McNear and his partner Isaac Wickersham the banker bought out the old haystack line and combined it with another line that they bought out in Petaluma, the Petaluma Street Railway. The Petaluma Street was a horse-drawn railway, and for their purchase they got 4 horses and 4 cars. They combined the two, renamed it the Petaluma and Santa Rosa, and electrified it. With an electric railroad, they tried to expand to Santa Rosa, and in doing so, created an all-out railroad war.
Well, we lived on East D Street in Edith, and it's only 2 blocks down to the railroad track. So we knew the train came in at 7:30 at night and such a time in the morning, and at evening we'd always go down there ahead of time, and we'd skate or ride our bicycles around the train station there and wait for the trains to come in, blow on their whistle, and a lot of parents would drive their cars down and let their children out and let's see that train come in and out. It was an important part of the day, and they'd make a lot of noise with their whistles, and that was exciting.
My dad was a machinist by trade, and he had gone through his apprenticeship and completed that right at the beginning of World War II, and he was hired by Southern Pacific as a machinist. Through the war years, he was frozen on the job because of the war years and the demands on the rail industry. After the war, he wanted to come back home to Petaluma to the ranch to raise his family, which he had started, because he thought that was a better way to raise children, was on the ranch. But by 1954, the chicken business the handwriting was on the wall, and he knew it was failing, and he didn't want to go in debt to keep it going because it obviously wasn't going anywhere. So he went back to work for the railroad, and he was able to go to work for Northwestern Pacific. It was right at the period when Northwestern Pacific was converting from steam to diesel. So really what they wanted were diesel mechanics, and he really wasn't. He was a steam machinist. And even though they sound the same, they aren't. They're technically different. And so the roadmaster asked him if he knew about the diesels, and he said no, he wasn't familiar with those. He was familiar with steam, but that he thought he could adapt to it because he did have a lot of mechanical interest in just mechanical things. And so they gave him the opportunity, and he went to work for Northwestern Pacific.
Yeah, my dad loved to work at railroad. He was a machinery kind of a nut, if you want to call it. He was fascinated with all kinds of things mechanical. And the locomotives and stuff were so powerful and such like that. It was like a big, strong thing, you know, and I guess that was all part of it.
One of the things I used to do, because we had our own chickens and what have you, is some of the boxcars would come in with bulk grain in them. In other words, it wasn't in sacks, but it was just poured in the top. And the places like poultry producers, they would go over these big grills and open up the doors, and the grain would just pour out of the boxcars and down into conveyor belts, which would take it into the mill. And I remember I would go down there with my bicycle and a couple burlap sacks, because there was always grain left over in those boxcars. And I would sweep it up, and I would bring home things such as wheat or barley or Milo or corn, whatever happened to be in that particular boxcar. And sometimes I would get up to a half a sack of grain in them. So we practically had all of our chickens free of charge as far as feeding them goes.
I'd go to Sonoma sometimes. He'd keep me out of school and things like that. We'd go over and just work with him when he was servicing the locomotives and stuff. I'd carry brake shoes and things like that when he was changing them and things. And I actually never did anything to him. And he'd show me the engines and how they worked and so forth. You know, they're kind of a big fascination thing.
A lot of times we used to go over to Sonoma and get these rides. A couple of times we got a ride down from Sonoma all the way down to Shelville, where they did the switching. Of course, once we got to Shelville, we had to get off, and we weren't allowed to stay on the train. I don't think we're supposed to be on the train in the first place, but we did get to do that little bit of a shot, and that was fine. I think my dad would call what was this road foreman's name? I can't remember, but I think he'd call him and tell him, say, hey, the kids are here. Is it all right if they ride down with a switch engine? The guy says, yeah, just tell them to stay in the cab or something like that, you know. Then off they'd go, kind of the old wink thing, and go ahead, you know. A lot different than it is today. I don't think you get away with that kind of stuff today.
I think it was about 56 or 57, so I'd be 12, 13, something like that. I used to go to work for my dad, with my dad, I should say. And then, of course, we'd climb locomotives and stuff as he serviced them and so forth. And that was kind of fun, you know. One of the things they did when they serviced them, they cleaned the spark arresters. They call it up on top. It's like a big screen that goes over the exhaust. And they pick up carbon there, and that can start a fire when they're out in service. So you clean all the carbon off the spark arresters. And so that's kind of fun, being up on top. You know, they're about 14, 15 feet high, whatever it is, you know. But so we had quite a time with that.
One time I asked my dad, I said, what makes them so interesting? You know, I mean, you got steam engines now, or freight engines now that are diesel and all that kind of, probably as powerful as the steam engines were, and he says it's the action of the wheels and the drivers and the steam blowing out the side, smoke coming up the smokestacks and that kind of stuff. Hang on a second, I'm gotta come back together here. But so that's what makes it, I think, interesting, is you get a lot of action out of it, and you don't get that with the diesel engines that you see today.
I remember when I was a kid, it must have been in the early 50s, he got a call late one night, and there was a locomotive stalled, or I think there was a group of locomotives, stalled right on the Wilfrid Crossing, they called it, where the old highway used to cross the railroad tracks. And the train was stalled there. We went up and during the night, and because we lived right close by out of Pengrove, you might say. So we came up to Cotati that night, and I went with him. And it was an electrical problem, you could tell right away. And the funny part was, we opened these big cabinet doors, and I remember it said 600 volts on them. And you open these cabinet doors and you start looking for what might be wrong. And it happened to be that I noticed, he said, well, this is where all the relays are that control that, or whatever it is. And I said, well, how come that one's a different color than the rest? And he says, wait a minute. He went back and looked, and that relay was defective. So he switched it with one from another circuit that didn't have to do with whatever the problem was. We switched the relays and put it back in. So when we're talking in 5 minutes or whatever, the guy goes and flips the switch on the throttle, and away it went, moved again. So that was all it was to it, is his relay had failed. But that was a pretty interesting night. And it was just that by chance. You know, well, how come that one's a different color? I thought, because they were all, say, silver or whatever, and this was kind of a goldish color or whatever it was. And I thought, well, why is that a different color? And it was this relay. So.
Well, I come from a railroad family. My grandfather had worked for them during World War II. And then when my father got out of the service right after the war, why, he went to work for the railroad. And so I grew up in a railroad family. When I got out of high school, I worked in a sawmill for a couple of years, and that was fun, it was interesting. But it was also hard work, not something I wanted to do the rest of my life. So I asked my dad if there was a chance of getting on with the railroad. And of course there was. Actually, railroads were pretty family-oriented that way. If you had a relation that worked on the railroad, you could probably get hired on. And railroad jobs were known as good jobs, a steady paycheck. And so I started for them in San Rafael, actually, in 1967.
We were very close family-wise. Just in general, you know, because of the relationship of how your fathers worked so many hours together and their close relationships like that. Yeah, our families were extremely close. You know, they always knew when somebody, you know, had a birth in the family because they were on the radios. Everybody knew everybody else's lives, you know, their family lives, you know, and celebrated them, you know, because it was not an 8 to 5 job, you know, it was pretty all-inclusive of the families.
Yes, there were bonds, and in many cases they were family bonds because there were fathers and sons and brothers and cousins and uncles and nephews. It was kind of a family-run railroad. Right or wrong, that's how it was. But also, I guess it's kind of like a military thing or something. There are people that have to maintain the track, there are the people that run the trains, there are people in the station, and they all have to work together, particularly if there is an emergency. And because we all knew each other from working together and also many times being related to one another, there was a real bond between the employees, particularly if there was an emergency, say a derailment or something. They would all come together and call in, see what they could do to help. I think the best example of that would be the flood of '64.
My father left, got up very early in the morning. This was kind of the routine at our house. My father had a company car that was always parked out in front of the house, and he got up very early in the morning and he had coffee, and then he went down to the depot and he was gone all day. And hopefully he came home at around 5, and dinner at our house was always at 5:30. But that didn't mean that the telephone rang constantly at our house. And it was always for my father, and it was always him. It was always railroad business, and it always had something to do with having to keep the telephones open line-wise, because that is consistently, it meant it was a disaster. It meant that there was some decision that had to be made along the line. So it wasn't like it was 24/7. You know, the phone rang in the middle of the night at our house, and my father would get up and leave. He might be gone for 3 days and not come home. You know, there was not like this set, you know, 8 to 5, you know, dinner time thing. There was Christmases. The flood in 1964 You know, there was one telephone call and everybody stood up from dinner and left. I mean, it was like, that's what the flood, you know, everything was down. The communication was down until that came back up. You know, they just worked, the weather was so awful and the floodings. And so nobody was home, you know. I don't remember seeing my father. I think I saw him on Christmas Day, but it was like, no, Dad's still gone. You know, because under those circumstances, you just come home and eat, you know, and then leave again.
Well, the Railroad War was over in 1905 and the railroad was booming, but it was very short-lived because just a few months later, the giant earthquake of San Francisco struck Sonoma County as well. Santa Rosa, the entire town was leveled. Over 100 deaths in Santa Rosa. In Sebastopol, major damage. In San Rafael, the giant San Rafael Hotel was leveled right to the ground. This was a huge blow for the railroads, but they did recover, and in recovering, they cleared away a lot of the debris of the giant earthquake. Fast forward now to 1937, when the Golden Gate Bridge was opened. It was soon found that taking freight by truck was at that time a lot cheaper than putting it on rail. It was also faster. It was the death knell of the railroads in Sonoma County. And in 1984, they abandoned their tracks. Interesting point. At that time, the president of Southern Pacific Railroad, the largest railroad in the world, was named Denman McNair. He was the grandson of the great John McNair. Denman, he was also the great grandson of great rancher Ezekiel Denman, two Petaluma families, and he was the president of the largest railroad in the world.
I have some memories of the Petaluma and Santa Rosa Railroad. My father graduated from Amley High School in Sebastopol in 1926 and needed money to go to UC Davis. So he came down, used to ride the Petaluma and Santa Rosa Railroad, was still electric then, down to Petaluma and work for the poultry producers, handling eggs, all of this stuff, and he did that. He'd work all day in the egg plant and then ride the train home and come back down the next day, and that's how he made his money to go to Davis. So if it wasn't for the Petaluma and Santa Rosa Railroad, I had a very different childhood.
When I worked there, the clerks, which would be the group that I belonged to, we ran the bridges. They didn't have drawbridge tenders up until the early 70s. So we would just go from the depot there, and we would drive down, because it was maybe 1.5 miles down there, so it was easier to drive. And the traffic, we generally had like 2 through trains coming down from Eureka every night. But we'd also have local trains that would go out. They would go and switch the Novato and, you know, the customers down there. And then we had another one that would go up to Healdsburg and get the gravel cars up there, but they didn't cross over the drawbridge. But, and then whenever a train would leave south, you'd have to have a corresponding one come north to get the empty cars to be loaded. So there would be maybe 8 trips a day to the drawbridge for trains either coming or going into Petaluma. Those were fun times there in Petaluma. We had 2 drawbridges that we would operate. A lot of people would think when we say drawbridge, we're talking about the D Street drawbridge, but we had nothing to do with that. That was only for automobiles. And the 2, what we call drawbridges, were incorrectly named. They were actually swing bridges, meaning they would pivot to the side rather than pull back. And there was one there at Petaluma, right under where the freeway is by Schoenberger Park. In the early days, they had drawbridge tenders, and the bridge would always be aligned for trains, but if a boat would come and the bridge tender could turn the bridge, let the boat through, and then line it back for trains. But eventually they got rid of the bridge tenders, and the bridges were always aligned for the boats, and we'd have to go down and close it for a train when a train would be coming. And that was a nice diversion. I always enjoyed going to the bridges.
As far as the railroads, they used to bring horses up here. They had slaughterhouses where they killed horses for horse meat. And a lot of times they'd have corrals down there, and the trains would jump the horses off in the corral, and they would run the horses right through the streets, right on out where Henny Penny's is now, in that area, because the slaughterhouses were out there. And they would actually run it right through town. And I can remember this. So a lot of things happened here. And it was a good community. I never wanted to leave it, you know.
I also always wanted to do what a couple of my friends did, and that was jump a train and ride to Eureka. But I know that I would have been put in reform school if I had done that. So my parents weren't going to allow me to jump a freight car and ride for, you know, a couple hundred miles.
You know, I think growing up, I mean, I think the size was always made an impression on you. You know, you're a little guy, you're looking up. I mean, they were big, and you know, there's steam engines on them, and you could see them, and you'd watch the wheels start to turn, you know, and all that type of stuff. And I remember my dad taking me on a he knew the people at Golden Eagle Mill very well, and I remember my dad taking me on a train ride from over in Napa to the Golden Eagle feed mill, which was a lot of fun. We sat up in the not the caboose, but right behind the engine. There was a little standing area there, and we were able. I think I was about, I don't know, 5 years old maybe, and it was pretty fun. Yeah.